The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. My name is Melissa Miller. I'm a science writer and one of your co-hosts.
And my name is James Floyd. I am a writer for StarWars.com and Star Wars Insider magazine. This episode, Star Warsologies, is going to chat about anthropology and alien design in Star Wars, as evidenced by all those cool aliens that we see that really could just be humans in a costume. Our guest expert today is Dr. Elizabeth Rega, who is a professor of anatomy at Western University and a consultant on over 40 films, including Mulan and Strange World, as well as the Madden video games. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hey, how are you doing? So glad to be here with you. This is an exciting topic for me.
Yes. Well, and Elizabeth was just part of our LA Comic-Con panel about science advisors, and it really was clear that any one of those people could have talked to me for 50 minutes about everything they knew. So here you get your chance. We don't have to cut to anyone else.
Well, thank you so much for letting me have your undivided attention. This is such an interesting, cool topic for any of us that do biology and particularly comparative anatomy. I am listed officially as a physical anthropologist, but what that means is my background is extensively in comparative vertebrate and human anatomy. And it is those kinds of educational pathways that allowed me to make a kind of contribution to the creatives as they're looking to kind of delineate the black and the white so that they can walk creatively in the gray.
How did you get into the field of physical anthropology?
Well, I think it had a lot to do with my compelling interest in biology and forms, combined with my disinterest in being in a hospital all the time. And so the obvious place for, those of us that were academically talented is, oh, you should go to med school. And I'm like, oh, I don't like being in hospitals. And so someone said, hey, be a physical anthropologist, excavate, do exciting things in the field. They didn't mention, take the pay cut that is associated with that. But, there are always expenses that we have when we live our dreams. And I do find it deeply ironic, but also very helpful that I am now a medical school professor. So I didn't go into medicine, but in fact, I am now living my life mostly indoors, unfortunately, but fortunately not in a hospital. But the same educational pathway that I walked, understanding form and function, it's not just memorization. It really helps my students become better healthcare practitioners, including physicians, dentists, physical therapists, and PAs, all of whom I've educated. And this semester, I'm at the Claremont Colleges in Claremont, California, teaching human anatomy. Last semester, I taught these students comparative vertebrate anatomy. I'm not just a human expert. I want to connect human form to what we share in common with all vertebrates.
For our listeners who listen to every episode, we had your husband, Stuart Samita, on a few episodes ago as well, and he's a paleontologist. And I think he did a pretty good job defining what he does as everything except humans and primates. And so that's sort of the niche that you fill in.
Well, it has historically been a niche that I've filled in, although I do have to say in my own research, I work on fossil animals, including things as early as 300 million years ago in terms of early mammal ancestors, I guess I would call them, even though they look like dinosaurs and have these great sails on their back, to as late as dinosaurs 60 million years ago, including T-Rex. And I also worked with and have named a species of sloth from the Caribbean. I know nature's coolest animals, God's favorite, the sloths. And cool. So those lines get very blurry. I would say that I look at organisms through time, developmentally and evolutionarily, and that includes humans. But one quite specifically, when I drill down on my actual research, I do the pathology of animals and humans in history. Whether it's 300 million years ago or 1,000 years ago, I concentrate normally on pathology. But to know pathology, you have to know normal.
Right.
And so most of my teaching to students isn't on dinosaur pathology because there may be 5 of us in the country that are interested in that. My teaching is to dental students on head and neck anatomy and what the architecture is that we share with all vertebrates. And that's my most recent lecture last Friday.
Okay.
I hope this has got everybody who has the same nerd background that I do very excited about the possibilities of that connection. because I love what you're doing with Star Wars. It's such a great hook for all of us that have been part of that lived universe, even those of us that are olds who literally sat there when it came out in the cinema, and our first view of that kind of Star Wars universe was going to be the Imperial cruiser coming right over your head.
Right.
At the age of 11. You never forget that.
Right.
You never forget that. And for our younger viewers who experienced it maybe in a different order, I'm very excited that this has had legs, and we have canon and non-canon, and provides a place for us to talk about science. So thank you for what you do.
Oh, yeah, we can't help ourselves. And it does turn out that here we are 47 episodes in, and we've got hundreds more ideas and people to talk to. So yeah, in order to sort of narrow it down, I kind of was thinking topic-wise about, to me at least, obviously the anatomy of a lot of the aliens in Star Wars are similar to humans because they are in fact humans wearing some sort of, costume. So
budget being what it is.
Exactly. Not being able to cast actual aliens. So I'm just curious, what is it that you see in Star Wars? Do you have favorite species that you love? And kind of what do you see with your, academic eye?
Well, I'm going to start with the kind of generalized answer and then go drill to specifics, because I do have favorite characters, and, some of them are not obscure. I'm not going to reach deep into the deep tracks there to pull up a character. What I will say is that what has, characterized both Star Wars and things like Star Trek before it, which clearly has a dialogue with Star Wars that is both similar and quite different, is that there is a rich tapestry of biological forms that are both vertebrate animals and invertebrates that is tapped for design cues. And I really love that. And so if we even go back to Star Trek and, the obvious sad answer to the man in the Gorn suit, right? We have one of our great aliens that's supposed to be a lizard, but it's clearly a guy in a bad lizard suit. That is endearing, but it is not necessarily what we're looking for. Is that an alien design? What you really want to do is not have that Gorn effect. Even if it is, someone in a alien suit, how do we make that not be quite as evident? So I do enjoy the times where things that are outside the kind of human area are being referenced. And I mean, we can go all the way to, you can talk about Twi'leks, for example, and what their head leku are. Right. Those are analogous most broadly to the proboscis of an elephant. And if I were to do the anatomy of Twi'lek leku, I would definitely look at the circumferential structure of those sphincter muscles and use that as a model. Right.
Yeah.
But also that same kind of muscularity is in the tentacles of an octopus. Right, which is not a vertebrate. So I think some of our more successful kind of concepts, and let's face it, of the aliens, if Comic-Con or other kinds of venues where fans get to dress up are an indication, Twi'leks are some of the most successful aliens. And I think it's because they fuse that really exotic with that attainable. And then thank goodness for clothes, because we don't have to discuss a lot of the anatomy because these characters are clothed. I've been looking for naked reference material and it's hard to come by, and I can see why.
Yeah, that's a whole Google search I don't want to do. Naked.
Right, exactly. Because God knows what you're going to pull up in the algorithm if you start doing that, because and the Ithorians as well. Right. Who doesn't love Ithorians? Clearly referencing hammerhead sharks, which when you see them are like, what the fluff?
Yeah.
That just does not seem like an obvious way to design a shark. And yet that particular, that's a 300 million year old body form.
Right. James will know more about the lore and how often they show up. But those ones for me were one of my favorite action figures as a kid.
Yeah.
I think it had like a moving sort of face or something like that. And then I see them a bunch in like the Clone Wars cartoons. But I was really excited to see in Book of Boba Fett, a little bit more close up, like how it communicates and stuff like that.
Yeah, with the mouths out of the side of the neck.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of that is very reminiscent of shark anatomy. With that kind of neck taking the place of the gill slits. In fact, our neck does have gill slits in it. You don't see them. They're modified. We call them things like your parathyroid gland or your tonsils or your auditory tube, your eustachian tubes. All of those are remnants of a gill slit structure that we had as embryos that it affects the fact that we're even talking right now, because your laryngeal cartilages, your tracheal cartilages, those are all gill arch bones that looked like gills when we were embryos, but became other stuff as we become adults.
Oh, that's
Fascinating.
So I think that it would be a very interesting exercise to go from the embryology of these aliens and then come up with the diversity of forms. And so, yeah, you've hit on one of my favorites.
So maybe that supposes that Ithorians may be more related to aquatic chordates that they evolved from and then eventually moved onto land.
Well, I understand when I look it up, they are, quote, widely spread.
Mhm.
So if they're going to be on Tatooine, they can't be obligate aquatic organisms.
Right.
But yes, their
Right.
home planet is
Very
Probably
lush.
is.
yeah, very
Yeah.
lush, jungly, not though
Yeah.
aquatic, not Naboo,
Right.
right? More of a jungle.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't really thinking back to what their planet would look like based on them is not something, it just comes up in a book somewhere and then
Mhm.
it's canon as opposed to consulting someone like you to be like, no, really it should be aquatic. And they
Well, and
no,
maybe
no.
that's how we advance canon to say clearly they have arisen out of an aquatic environment, just like terrestrial vertebrates on Earth emerged very clearly from an aquatic environment, which is why, as embryos, we still have things that are based on gills. Now, I want to make it clear our gills don't function as gills when we're an embryo, but the structure is there. And if you look at a fish and you look at us at the same embryonic stage, we have the same structures.
Yeah.
So I do think that there is a hidden aquatic origin
Mhm.
to Ithorians that ought to be explored. And I would love to see what the baby Ithorians look like, because sometimes you see tadpoles being referenced for some forms.
Mhm.
I think we see that when we go to Gungans. I think Gungans
Yeah.
are held to have tadpoles. And I wanted to give the controversial answer to my favorite alien being a Gungan.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that.
That's really throwing down a controversial answer. And I say that only in part or largely in part because I am one of the individuals that is convinced that Jar Jar Binks is a Sith Lord. I am utterly convinced by that. Right.
Amazing.
Yeah, and could have seen, and I understand that if the popular press is to be believed, that there are other highly placed individuals who also think that Gungans are their favorite.
Mhm.
Yeah. No, and I'm trying to think, you mentioned like little, baby Ithorians. I'm trying to think how many times we see young and, grown up ones. I don't think we ever see embryonic that I know. Actually, the frog lady, right? The frog lady
The
has
frog
those
lady,
eggs.
yeah.
Implies tadpole. So that's at least what I was assuming,
Yeah.
sort of lifestyle. What else, James?
Oh, I was going to say, obviously, we see the clone troopers when they're free birth, essentially. But, those are humans, so it's not something that we necessarily jump on. But at the same time, it's like, when you think about it, most of the life we're aware of are Earth-based and therefore, came out of an aquatic environment. So it'd be interesting to see what species would evolve in a non-aquatic environment, or is that really possible? Or maybe, from a space-based environment.
Well, and I always like to go back to the black and the white that we have in the diversity of life on Earth. We have perfectly functional pigs that decided to go back into the water and become cetaceans, right? Whales and porpoises. A perfectly reasonable pig at the side of the river. Why would you do that? And yet, if you look at a hippopotamus in 300 million years, is a hippopotamus going to... Now, keep in mind that whales and dolphins didn't re-evolve gills, did they? Embryonically, they have gills or gill structures, but they're still committed to lungs because you can't change all of that developmental and evolutionary pathway. So you do weird things like take their nostrils and move them to the top of their head.
Right.
Right. And that is a crazy, and we're talking about that evolution in what, 60 million years? That is a crazy fast modification to go from a pig to an orca. Yeah. So I think that in terms of looking through, and that's what I do when I work with animators, whether we're working with something like, and I have to be quite specific about this, the animated original Mulan, not the live action one. We had to go to first principles about that. As we move into humans, the principal issue with Mulan was the studios had a very poor history of depicting variation. right? Human variation, the kind of variation that we may call race, but that's not the world's greatest word for it. And in picking a story that is culturally significant to people in what is China now, we felt that we had to be extremely careful in depicting the features of Chinese people to be accurate and make sure that it supported her character and didn't play into the history of caricature that so much of animation, including but not limited to Disney, had engaged in for much of, let's say, the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so we had to be very conscious of that. And I think that, and it was based on shape. Just to cut to the chase, one of the reasons Mulan was my favorite is I was working with some extremely talented, dedicated animators, including Ruben Aquino, who did Shang. And we went head to head with the studios, pun intended, about the head shape. Mm-hmm. Because essentially Asian head shapes are on average broad from side to side and narrow from front to back, whereas European head shapes are on average the opposite of that, as are sub-Saharan African head shapes. Now, there is variation in all things, but to take a narrow European looking head and put Asian eye shapes on that was not only inaccurate, it was offensive. And so in order to prevent that kind of, quote, Barbie doll with the kind of slanty eyes, unquote, appearance, there was a real concerted effort by intellectually honest people to try to come up with how do we do that? And I think it was not just the product, but the exercise of doing that. Mm-hmm. And including previously, we had done that with Pocahontas, with not probably as much success, but with just as much sincerity. That they were able to, I think, come up with a character who continues to be, out of all of those characters from that golden age revival that I was able to participate in as an anatomist and consultant, I think that Mulan has the most legs. If you ask classrooms of undergraduates, who's your favorite Disney heroine, Mulan is often the top answer. And I think it's, she is not a princess. She fights for what is important to her. She wasn't in high heels, right? I think, in fact, in many ways, until Cinderella, of course, is stripped by the evil stepsisters and is there sad and flat-footed in the garret, right? That was the last time we saw a Disney heroine that wasn't in high heels. And then we get to Pocahontas and Mulan, and that's very symbolic that they were engaging not only in, a sincere look at what the physiognomy should be, but what the biology and locomotion should be. So as we move that then into aliens, it's the same thing. If you're going to create a really compelling alien, you've got to have a really compelling kind of backstory, and that backstory should involve the gills. And so that is what I say about Jar Jar, because I was going to bring that back to Gungans. Right. Gungans are clearly humanoid. I wish their gills were obvious because they should be, and they're not. And it doesn't mean they have to be placed like earth vertebrate gills along the neck. Right. But I think that the ears, or what we look at as ears, present a kind of opportunity for those to be gills, like axolotls. Mm-hmm. Those salamanders have gills. Yeah. I think they missed an opportunity with those. Because how popular axolotls are, I feel like there's gonna be a Star Wars. It's due for sure a Star Wars creature with that.
Well, and I think there are that Klaud that we see in The Rise of Skywalker. He looks kind of like a big slug, but he's got those axolotl little things coming off the sides of his head. So I think that's what inspired those. And if you're playing the Jedi Survivor game, there's another one of those species that is hilarious in it. But yeah, I think that's what it is. But it's kind of an axolotl that grew up really big, but then just became a big slug, essentially in body shape.
Yeah, they smushed two things together, so it wasn't just a straight axolotl. Yeah. I have an idea for Jar Jar's gills, and you'll have to tell me if this is right or not. But I feel like I learned at some point that sea turtles can breathe out of their butts. And so now I want Jar Jar to breathe out of his butt. Well, I'll tell you, I have a couple little bubbles,
I love that. I love that. I have some red-legged tortoises in my possession that I use as animal ambassadors for my teaching. They are notorious for taking in water through their cloaca. The technical term for that butthole would be cloaca, because it fuses both the urinary tract and what we would call a rectum. It's like the urethra and rectum are fused. And that is the normal state for many animals, particularly aquatic animals. Yeah, I could see Jar Jar, if not breathing through his butt, I could definitely see him taking in water. I would like to see him sidle up to the bar and then kind of put his
Oh my
posterior
God.
in it. Because that I have to go fill my tortoise water every single day because they drink through their cloaca.
Amazing.
And these are highly terrestrial animals. I want to make it clear, these are not aquatic turtles. These are tortoises
Right.
who still take in water from both ends. I've seen them drink, but they definitely take it in from there. I could be, and for a variety of reasons, I think we could all agree that if Jar Jar would be the Gungan to drink from his butt.
Well, except that they live in their cities that are air-filled. So that, maybe their gills have gone away because they're air breathers, or maybe they metamorphose. And so their tadpole state is gills, and like amphibians on Earth, they go to a lung-based system. Is that true?
Yeah, but our amphibians on Earth really go to a skin-based system. They respirate as much through their skin as they do through their lungs. And that's where, again, Jar Jar needs more thinking. Gungans need more thinking, because if those ears are gills that are still active, then they should have gill covers. Maybe they have special clothes to keep those gills, because what happens with gills is they desiccate. That is the barrier to keeping your gills on land. And so anybody that has gills on land, and those little roly-poly bugs, those have gills. They look like crustaceans because they are, but they have to be under those plates to keep them moist. I would love to see Gungans squirting themselves with water all the time to keep themselves moist. There's a lot.
Especially in Tatooine, he does talk about drying out,
he's
right?
like, this is murder to my skin. So, maybe as soon as he goes indoors somewhere, he's just like, please, just let me soak my head.
Yeah, somebody spray me down. But this entire conversation is probably giving the really unfortunate impression that I am a big Gungan fan, because I think it provides a lot of grist for our mill to discuss what the possibilities could have been and would have been. And I will point out as well that what is unusual about Jar Jar Binks is that he is digitigrade, right? For a lot of the humanoid aliens that are done in Star Wars, most of them are not digitigrade, because it involves, if you're in a costume, then it would involve using like drywall stilts.
Can you explain digitigrade?
Yeah, and digitigrade means like your dog or cat. If you look at their leg or their arm, but particularly their leg, their heel is not flat on the ground. Their heel is up. And so it makes it look like, how you look at a horse and you go, why is their knee pointing backwards? Well, their knee is not pointing backwards. It is their heel, and their foot is hella long.
Right.
So that is what Jar Jar is. Jar Jar has what I like to think of as the ILM alien go-to. Any alien designed by ILM has a 95% chance of being digitigrade.
Versus the angle of the legs and sort of just breaks
makes you look a little different, takes away from it. But to be digitigrade and have the backbone then be straight up and down is also awkward and non-functional. So what I would love to see for Jar Jar and all Gungans is, given their digitigrade limb, their backbone ought to be angled slightly forward. They should not be quite as straight up and down. Right. So again, I love Gungans because they're ample topical kind of grist, like many other people that have, basically a limbic system and an oxytocin secreting brain, is that clearly my favorites are going to be whatever species Yoda, Yaddle, and Grogu are.
Okay.
And you know why they're everybody's favorite, because we are programmed to love the way these little babies look. And because they look like babies, we can't help it. We get this little squirt of oxytocin, and we will buy their product. Simple as that. And that is also a tale as old as time, in that many of us are familiar with Stephen Jay Gould's landmark publication on the evolution of Mickey Mouse. And he came up with the fact that Mickey Mouse had evolved the same way that humans had done, by a means which is called pedomorphosis or pedogenesis, which simply means retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood.
Oh.
We are essentially baby apes that retained our ability to be smart and learn. and it's reflected in our faces and our hands and our bodies. And he showed that Mickey Mouse started off as a rat, and that as he aged through time, he became more and more a toddler. And you can see the changes in the big head, the long torso, the short limbs, the stubby, all of it's easily mapped out. And he did an excellent illustration depicting this. Yeah. And I would say that obviously the Grogo Yoda species, and I really wish someone would have come up with a good name. That has been long for that to be awkward.
Yet, right?
They don't, and I hope they never give a name to that species, just to keep some mystery there. That's my own thing. And I personally think that they never will.
And for me, the mystery is I love these little guys, but they have clothed them to the point where you can make virtually no judgments. Now, we all know that the segmented forehead thing is a popular trope, right? So I'm going to go back to, again, Star Trek, if we think of Worf, right? But we also then, our Klingons, our Romulans and things. But we see that as well with, I think, the Thrawn. Right? They may be humans with just blue skin, but look, they also have that forehead. Yeah. Let's mess around with the forehead, put a little prosthetic on the forehead, give them a bald head.
Right.
And now you can be sufficiently alien that will respond to that.
Yeah, no, those ones are interesting to me because you're right. When you point it out, it's like, oh yeah, that's an obvious thing. It's like, that's some real estate. It doesn't really mess with the actor's ability to work or whatever, to just throw some prosthetics there and slap a coat of paint on you.
Oh yeah, that segmented nose is a terrific way to do it when you go further down there. But it is, how do we address the fact that we have people in alien costumes and Wookiees, man? I mean, I don't know what you can say about Wookiees. All that hair, all that height.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
definitely made me think. I mean, I always thought Chewbacca I liked to think about where Chewbacca came from when I was little, because I don't think they showed Kashyyyk, is that right? The planet?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess they did. They showed it in the Star
holiday
Wars
special.
Holiday special. So I just didn't know about the holiday special when I was a kid. I was saved from that horror. But yeah, I mean, I just assumed, I don't know, a little bit different, a little bit more obvious why, a cold planet, right? Like a Hoth type planet. So you had to be shaggy or something. But just a nice looking forest, also fine.
Well, it certainly puts us together with, the Ewoks, and are they sister taxa? Are Wookiees and Ewoks sister taxa?
Yeah, well, and I think originally, if I remember correctly, George Lucas wanted the Ewok planet to be like the Wookiee planet. And then he's like, oh, no, but we're going to have a Wookiee already, so we'll just make it something a little bit different. Make them shorter.
Well, and let's face it, the toys, the possibilities, the toys and the merchandising and the marketing. Yeah, those were heavily marketed and did not become quite as beloved, I think, as was anticipated in that film, because they do have these savage little faces that are very reminiscent of bats.
Oh.
If you've ever looked at little bat faces, because of their echolocators and the nose and everything, they can be quite adorable, but also really off-putting. Yeah, and I would love to see more alien designs based on bat faces.
There is in Star Wars, I don't know if we've seen it in live action, and James, I'm sure, will remember the name of the species, but there is they're very short, and they definitely have the bat nose, big ears. And
we see one originally in the cantina. There's the little Kabe or Cabe. You see her walking up and wanting a little drink from the bar.
Right.
But yeah, she's very bat faced.
Because I've seen it in a couple of the animated shows where they have a character that is that same species. And I honestly forgot it starts in the cantina, of course.
Yeah.
It's very iconic.
Yeah, and I think there's another kind of maybe more bat-faced creature also in the cantina. It was one of those ones where it was in the reshoots and they just needed more aliens and they didn't have time to develop as many as their own. And they just basically used Halloween masks off the shelf with a little bit of alteration. And so there's some that are definitely more, it's just a giant vampire bat type look.
Right.
But I'm just curious, there's that whole short phenomenon in Star Wars that, Star Wars is actually kind of pretty cool in that they used a lot of little people actors for these things that you wouldn't expect, that we don't see in other sci-fi properties, that as there's a lot more short species, Jawas and Ugnaughts and Ewoks.
If what you were talking about with the leg position and other things, I know when we've talked to the concept artist too, he's always really into breaking the human form, with the puppetry stuff where it's like, the neck is actually a hand, above the actor's head or things like that, just to sort of get outside of our average human shapes and stuff like that. So, because there's, especially with Star Wars being so practical, right? I know we talked about Jar Jar, which is a completely digital character, but for the most part, these are humans in, different sort of costumes and things like that.
And I love the practical effect. I think we sense that as an audience. The practical effects can sometimes just be more connecting. I feel for me that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has spiraled out of control. The digital is so much now that it has just lost its impact.
Right.
And that some of these practical effects, and we saw this with Baby Grogu in Mandalorian.
Yeah.
Right.
Mostly a practical effect, and the performance that they are able to get out of the actors in the same frame with Baby Grogu is really compelling. And I think in part there is a strong physical presence, and that puppeteering should not be dismissed as lightly as it often is.
And I think that is one of the strengths of Star Wars is also the puppeteering, that, we have Jabba, we have a lot of the other aliens that, were done as puppets, and they were done very novelly. Like, Sy Snootles in Jabba's throne room was basically a puppet where it was a reverse marionette, where instead of somebody controlling from the top, they were controlling from the floor underneath and making the same movements to have the original Sy Snootles make those movements, but be in a completely alien shape. It couldn't be a person in a suit.
Those hold up so much better, like you're saying. Like already some MCU movies look wrong and weird. And you go back to, 1977 or whatever, and you're just like, nope, still looks real. Still awesome.
Yeah.
But one of the things you mentioned earlier with the digitigrade is that on Earth, pretty much like only primates and elephants are not digitigrade. I'm sure there's a word for that.
And reptiles. Okay. I mean, amongst the mammals... Right. The primitive state is to be what's called plantigrade, with your heel on the ground. And that's going to include lizards and other stuff. But amongst then mammals, there's very few of us that stayed with that model in the interest of running fast. Digitigrade is a way to run much faster. It's turning your limb into, if you think about the speed of the end of the whip, it's more like cracking a whip, right? It's very light on the end and all the muscle is close in. Well, think of a horse running. It's got all the muscle close in at the hip and a very light distal limb. It allows the limb to move much, much faster. So if you can move your muscle close to the body and keep your foot and ankle and hands skinny and long, it gives you more speed. Yeah. And there was amongst mammals really an arms race between carnivores and herbivores that continues to this day. And both of them adopted that digitigrade, and to the point where, cattle are ungulagrade. They're not just up on their toes, they're on the hoof.
Right.
And then horses go even further by being fully ungulagrade, and they are standing on their middle finger like a ballet dancer.
That's wild.
So basically, humans, what's the deal? Why did we go to this model?
Well, because we're generalized. We do know one thing great, but we're clever. We have young brains, so we continue to learn. And let's face it, we may not be able to run very fast, but we can walk forever, right? This is a Stephen Wright quote. Walking distance really depends on how long you have. Because if you've got a couple years, then Tierra del Fuego is still walking distance. As humans, I think that our locomotion is not optimized for speed. We are optimized for generality. And then keep in mind, we have an upright vertebral column. Nobody else has that. There are lots of bipeds. Birds are bipeds. Dinosaurs are bipeds. But their vertebral column is parallel to the ground or almost parallel to the ground. Ours is perpendicular. Whole new world. So that's what we really did. We didn't care about our feet because we rotated around our hips, and that changed everything. And interestingly, I'm just having seen the new Godzilla -1 film. You look at that pectoralis. That's a guy in a lizard suit again. I mean, as a homage, of course, to the original design, because that constraint is not there with Godzilla. And it is a terrific film for people that haven't seen it. Really very faithful.
So, we've got that upright stance, before humans were fully upright, like Neanderthals. How do you train people to walk like that?
I think that's an excellent question, and I really appreciating you kind of teeing that up for me. One of the things that I was able to do with live action is to work with actors playing Neanderthals. And the remit for this film, which is still as yet unreleased, was that we need these to read differently. But what we know currently about Neanderthals is that they are very highly flexible, adaptable, extremely strong, very broad hips relative to modern humans. And so that was my base of concern. If we have broad hips and we're looking at control over lateral movement, let's create a walk that has that side to side movement so that you know that it is distinctively not human. But it comes back to that idea of know the black and the white to walk in the gray, right? We don't know how Neanderthals walked, and it may very well be that they have excellent balance to the point where they wouldn't be swaying back and forth. But we needed something that both played into their anatomy and made them distinctive and yet not subhuman. What they were not looking for is the hunched over, knuckle dragging, caveman kind of thing. Because one, knuckle walking is a very derived trait. It's not primitive, and only chimpanzees and gorillas do it. And secondly, no, Neanderthals were fully upright, even more fully upright than we are.
Wow.
So those things are kind of a compromise in that we're going to take a piece of anatomy and we'll say, look, let's go with the wide hips and let's go with the very broad thorax that characterizes Neanderthal and have their movement be back and forth, but not so much so that it looks like we're play acting being primitive. It was very subtle, and it took training of about 3 weeks with young actors so that that became a natural way of walking. And the only thing we had to do was soften the knee. Your listeners can do that themselves. When we walk, we hit with a heel strike that has a very stiff knee. If you simply soften your knee slightly, you will replicate the Neanderthal walk that we came up with. It drove itself. We didn't have to fake it. And as an anatomist, those are the kind of fun things to do. Watch, what is the science and what is it that we then circle back to for the creative. I'll tell you, my biggest pet peeve is a muscle that's known as, and everybody should brace themselves, the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Got a great name. It makes you sound smart, sternocleidomastoid. It is this V-shaped muscle that goes from behind our ears down to our clavicle and our sternum. That's why it's called sternocleidomastoid. The mastoid is the bump behind your ears. And that is a very distinctive muscle in all vertebrate animals that are terrestrial that is derived from a gill arch muscle. Remember our embryos and the gills at the very beginning? It has a really weird origin. That one and our trapezius. And if you think about the triangle of the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid, those are classic art school, hang your hat on them, human form. Every single space alien you see has a sternocleidomastoid. Remember the alien autopsy long ago? Is it real? No, not a sternocleidomastoid. What is the chance that an extraterrestrial alien would exactly replicate the evolutionary pathway of vertebrates coming onto land?
Yeah.
And yet, if you have a sternocleidomastoid, I don't believe you. I don't believe you and that is our indicator. So I will say you have it on good authority from any biologist that teaches developmental biology that muscle has a particularly very strange evolutionary and developmental history, and it would be vanishingly unlikely that an organism on another planet would have gone through exactly that same aquatic gill having to land and converting all of that other stuff, as I said, to larynx, laryngeal cartilages, tracheal cartilages, all of that stuff. We're really special and we don't even know it.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
So cool. All of you alien designers out there, cut that muscle out or change it to be slightly different, moving in different directions.
Yeah.
Yeah, work on
because
the shoulder,
it's a cliche.
Different shapes or whatever.
Right.
You've done the leg
cliche.
one already. Let's pick the shoulder.
Yeah, do a different design and don't use sternocleidomastoid and don't use trapezius and see how that frees you up. Because that is so characteristic. We just think that's the only way to do business, but it's not.
Yeah. And that's another easy thing to do, right? Like literally the costume, like shoulder pads from back in the 80s, messed up that line a little bit. Like that's an easy thing to do in costumes or prosthetics or whatever.
It really should be. But in the immortal words of Parliament Funkadelic, right? Free your mind and your ass will follow.
Okay, I wish we could talk about this a lot longer because we didn't even scratch the surface. But just to wrap up, why don't you tell us about your favorite Star Wars character?
I do come back to needing and wanting to know more about certain things. Like, for instance, Max Rebo, I'd like to know how he plays the piano because, as a kind of elephantoid creature, I've looked at him and he does seem to just be banging.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking he must have mind control that we're not seeing that's allowing the jazz music to flow.
We did talk about that with our musician, right? Was like,
Mhm.
if that is that really an organ? It doesn't seem like he's playing certain keys.
Yeah.
Well, and also if you look at I mean, something I didn't know because I had the action figure, and the action figure is sort of humanoid shaped, has legs and hands and arms. But the maquette, and I guess the intention behind the creature was that it just have two limbs, and those are, his feet kind of coming up.
Mhm.
And there's not more below the organ that you're
Yeah.
seeing. So lots
Yeah.
of questions.
Let's face it, I'm going to circle back to Grogu and Yoda. I need to see them naked. I think it is time for us to see them unclothed because we have very few clues, right?
Mhm.
And I think the public finally needs to know. And no one's asking anyone out there to do a deep fake, although that's probably an invitation to do so. But I'd like to see, the character designers kind of committing to showing what almost certainly they've
Oh,
already designed, right? Underneath that maquette, there is a body, but
I,
we've never seen it.
I think we'll find out the truth that they really are potato sack shaped, just like the robes they wear. But of course, what we see Yoda's range of movement in when he's fighting in lightsaber duels, then it's like, okay, it's more humanish. Is it kind of a standard little person size in the proportions of the legs and the torso? What's going on there?
Right.
We don't. We
Yeah.
don't know how long the legs are. We don't know the torso shape. We don't know if there's torso features there, external protuberances. Do we have two hearts? All of that stuff. Cute little heads with, you'll notice a little bit of that segmentation to give you
Yeah.
that interest, and the large ears, which
Right.
we're assuming make you very acute at hearing. And so that's what I would love to see. I want to see more on that species that is yet to be named. And I'm not sure, James, if I agree that I'm glad that the species hasn't been named because it just makes it very awkward to discuss. And, scientists love species and genuses, so we at least have clarity as to who we're discussing.
Yeah, now that there's three of them, like even if they don't know their home planet, even if they all happen to be like orphans who have no memories of their early years or whatever, like give them a name just so we can refer to them as something.
And how did Yaddle get that kind of I Dream of Jeannie hairstyle, man?
Right, exactly. I think, is it a wig? Is it female?
Extensions.
Right,
It does look a little like extensions because she's just got that little, I'm thinking she has that little gray hair and she's got some very elaborate, expensive extensions.
Right. Do you generally want to share, if someone's interested in getting into the field, how would you recommend going about that? Your academic field and also, the consulting and stuff like that. So if you have an answer for that.
Yeah, I do. I would say for people that are looking to get into this field, educate yourself broadly. Please go to the original literature and textbooks. Don't just take the first answer in Google as your answer. We know that that's not a great practice anymore, especially now. And a biology background is helpful, even if you're interested in art. If you know kind of the range of diversity that's out there, not just in vertebrates, but invertebrates, then as an artist, that helps you enormously. And so there is a lot of reference that you can do on that. Even National Geographic, Smithsonian, looking at publications that pull up illustrations to show you that range of possibility. I think the more that we're aware of, truth is stranger than fiction. The actual biology is sometimes weirder than you could ever dream up yourself. So look at some of those deep sea adaptations or the craziness that goes on in bats, which are very extreme morphotypes. We didn't even talk about them in great extent. And I think that will help with the art and help make character designs less conventional and formulaic.
Yeah, definitely. That there's a lot in the evolutionary process that you could say it went this way. What happens if it didn't go that way, if it went a different way, but we ended up with something similar, but like with the sternocleidomastoid
Sternocleido, mastoid.
mastoid muscles, like If it took a different route, what would that look like?
What would it be? If we came via a cephalopod, like an octopus, what would the terrestrial kind of equivalent be? And no, it would not have a sternocleidomastoid. I've seen aliens based on octopus, and they still have a sternocleidomastoid as well as tentacles. Completely unnecessary and wrong. So I would put it out there. And also just thank you guys so much for the opportunity to have these discussions. It goes both ways, that the art and creativity feed our medical students and pre-medical students, and I think help us kind of create this narration where we really do have a continuum of art and science. They aren't artificial divides, and we should be continuing to support you guys in your endeavor to bring that forward to your listening audience. So thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being on the show with us today.
Yes, thank you so much. I learned a lot.
Awesome. Thank you. And maybe we can do a volume 2 if we come up with more interesting points of discussion, or if your listeners have some ideas of things they want to discuss.
Yes.
Sounds good.
Definitely. I could always talk about this, as we know.
Thank you again for the invitation.
That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Dr. Elizabeth Rega, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
Looking for the links we talked about? Check out our show notes page available at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And also check out the Star Warsologies YouTube channel, where we post some episodes with related visuals from Star Wars. I recently put up the LA Comic-Con panels with lots of cool slides, so check those out.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. We also have a fan group on Facebook. It's called the Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group. So join today, chat with us and your fellow listeners.
Yes, we always love to know what you're thinking. And please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service, and share it with your friends.
No topic is off limits, even figuring out what Luke meant by, "What is that flashing?"
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including Talking Apes, the Neverland Clubhouse, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland, which I was recently a guest on, so check that out. There's also a YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies, where we will be talking about conflict resolution in Star Wars.